Okay, hello everyone. We are starting part two of our, or this is our second meeting for our book club, and we will be discussing "So You Want to Talk About Race" by Ijeoma Oluo. Please forgive me if I pronounce it incorrectly. I don't want to, but that's the book that we'll be discussing. We like to always give the disclaimer before we start. Conversations about race can definitely be uncomfortable and difficult, but the whole purpose of this is to show people that it can be done. And we want to make sure that we note that none of us on here are experts. We're only speaking from our lived experiences, and we're extending each other grace to be able to understand and create an environment where we feel welcome to speak about our experiences. And none of us here today are speaking for an entire group of people or race of people, just our lived experiences. We may or may not have a friend join us a little later, but if he is able to join in, he'll just jump right in. And other than that, we'll go ahead and get started. And we'll be talking about chapters 5 through 8. So Robin, start us off, friend.
Okay, so last time we began with an opening quote, and so we wanted to begin this one with a quote as well. And so this one was on page 75, and it says, "Each of us has a myriad of identities, our gender, class, race, sexuality, and so much more that inform our experiences in life and our interactions with the world." And we just wanted to open with that quote in particular because we think it really highlights why it's important to have discussions with people who are different from you, who have different backgrounds, different identities from you, because everybody has this unique lens that they experience and view the world from. And so in order to be able to understand what other people may go through in life, you have to interact with all of those different identities that may differ from yours. So we want to start off just with that quote. And then we had one question from the intersectionality chapter that we wanted to pose to you guys or bring up to you guys. And so it was basically about this quote, and I'll read it. And so it goes, "Intersectionality forces people to interact with, listen to, and consider people they don't usually interact with, listen to, or consider. People like to form groups with people they consider similar to themselves. Many of us spend a lot of our days with people like us, people with similar backgrounds, goals, identities, and personalities. This is human nature." And so what we wanted to ask was, when you guys are thinking about social justice or fighting oppression and things like that, do you guys find yourselves only considering the groups that you identify with or the groups that you surround yourself with? Do you feel like you resonate with this quote, or you have this problem where you do tend to surround yourself with people similar to you, and how you can combat that and sort of being inclusive when you're talking about fighting for social justice for all people? Any thoughts? No, that was kind of long. Yeah.
I can go. So I've been thinking about that question a lot lately with different schools posting different statements and demands and grievances, which now a group of students from Wofford is doing as well. And I often find myself asking, what could I have done differently at Wofford? It is a PWI, and it's easy for me because I'm Indian. I could either become totally whitewashed, which a lot of my college experience that I look back on it I was in a sorority, student government, not the top of my class, but I was involved with my academics. I double majored. But then on the other hand, we always talked about these diversity and inclusion committees, and a lot of times it was just talk. And now we're looking back and we're thinking about all of these different climate surveys and committees were formed and nothing happened. And now we're at this crossroad of what didn't we do? Why didn't we put our actions to our talk? And I often think about the people, I loved my people at Wofford, but that's kind of what I stuck with all the time. And I never really found myself advocating for those who couldn't advocate for themselves, because I was privileged enough to serve in different roles, and now I like look back on my time and I feel like I should have done more, but now I'm still giving back, and I'm still part of that like advocacy group. And we came up with like a list of grievances and demands, and now I finally feel like, now that I'm graduated from college and like away from that social circle, that I don't have that pressure of like quote unquote whitewashing myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that was really insightful, and I think that a lot of people can relate to what you just said, because I think it's really comfortable to just, when you hang out with a certain group of people, it's like comfortable and like you're in your comfort zone to only stick to that and only stick to what you know. And I think everybody can relate to, well, what could I have done better? I could have done more. Like I definitely feel like in my college experience, I could have done way more, but it's difficult. And so, yeah, I agree with what you said. I like what you said. Anyone else have any thoughts?
I'll add, because I like that was brought up, just because I think sometimes for myself, like, it's easier for me sometimes to be around the people that I can relate to, because when I'm venting, they automatically understand. When I'm excited about something, I guess they kind of may have a better insight as to why, or the context that I'm coming from when I'm speaking to them. And I'll be honest, like sometimes it is uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable, not because I don't like other people who are different than me, or because for any malicious reason. I think sometimes it's just uncomfortable because in the back of my head, whether I'm conscious of it or not, I think it's that idea that, like, will this person understand me? Will they accept me? And is this a safe space? And sometimes out of fear of not knowing that, I may shy away from opportunities to branch out of my circle of friends or people that I talk to every day. And I really liked what Bali mentioned, because I do see it a lot, like with on campuses where there's a lot of like surveys that are sent out about what can we do to fix, racial relationships on campus and increase diversity and things like that. And then we wonder, like, why don't things change? I think a part of that plays into this idea of us truly not making an effort to really reach beyond our circle of influence. Like, it's one thing to talk about it. Like, it's easy for me to talk about things that I go and I face as a Black American to my Black peers. But at a certain extent, it doesn't accomplish as much as it could if I had that same conversation with one of my, friends who didn't identify the same as me. And so I think a part of that is, how do we like push each other outside of our comfort? And I think it is human nature to a certain extent, but it's something that I'm starting to realize more and more that we have to do if we ever want to accomplish anything concerning race relations in our schools, in this country, et cetera, et cetera.
I think I wanted to bring up a point where I think I loved when she said, kind of in the chapter, when she talked about intersectionality is slow. And when you make that, when you have everyone at the table, the quote unquote table we're always speaking of, it's going to be slower. But I think we have to, when we're doing this type of work and even having these conversations, we have to be committed to that slow process, even though I think our generation loves things microwave. We want stuff fast. We want things results very quickly. That's just what we like. Our generation has a lot of access to things, so we want it now. But in a lot of times when we're thinking about, the Black Lives Matter movement, different things like that, we need to make sure we're including all of the Black lives. Like, we're talking about our Black trans people, our Black women who never get talked about enough with their different murders and stuff that's gone on in the past. We need to keep that same energy for those same disenfranchised groups that a lot of time aren't just the norm, aren't just the Black man or like the George Floyd, but let's make sure we bring up Go Harder for Breonna, let's remember Sandra Bland and different people like that. It's slower, it is. but it's a well worth commitment when you're talking about inclusivity. I think it is a harm when you don't try to have everyone, even though that process is slow. And I've seen it before. Like I've been student government and things like that, and I never think about like disabled people or like inaccessibility issues. That's not the thing I don't think about enough. And that's something I've been trying to challenge myself with personally.
Yeah, I think that's good, because I think it's important when you recognize when you've sort of been lacking in an area where you don't think about a particular group. I think it's important that you recognized that and that you're actually actively trying to include that in your thought, like include that in your activism, and when you're like fighting for social justice and things like that. So I really like that statement.
Yeah, and
Also, I think it's important to think about kind of like the ways in which we go about making change and thinking about like what the historical approach has been and why that may not be the most effective. Because if historically, like a university, for example, because that's just like where I'm at in life, hasn't made like a lot of progress with regards to like racial justice or social justice on campus, especially towards specific student groups, then I think it's important to like not fall into this kind of like repeated cycle of like doing climate surveys, task forces, and putting together committees. Because I actually saw a tweet about this. You can learn a lot on Twitter, but it was talking about how like these kinds of things are oftentimes like distractions from like the real problem or how to actually make change. And I think about this a lot too when a lot of people in like the recent like weeks with all of like the national events and protests happening have been saying that like how can we depend on a system that has like oppressed Black people for so long to be the same system that like brings them out of that oppression. And I think we can carry that same mindset when it comes to like how we create changes in our own communities, is not falling back on the traditional ways that we've been told are effective at making change, and kind of being innovative and like Thomas was mentioning, kind of like taking it slow and thinking about like intersectionality and bringing in like different pieces every time.
I agree with Rowan. I think it's kind of like what I've been seeing over these past few weeks, is that this next generation, our generation, has come up with new ideas and new changes to the different traditional ways that we have been doing with, protesting, with fighting for racial and social injustice. So I do agree. I think that's big for us to continue to do. And I think that, we can't let anything or anybody hold us back from exploring these changes. And I think the biggest thing is that we work together throughout all of this. Because myself, like, I can't know everything about this person or that thing, because like my brain can't hold it. I got a big head, but my brain can't hold that much. So making sure that I, connect with other people and, form our circles so that we all can have valuable information that we can share with one another and try to figure this thing out together, instead of like putting it all on ourselves. So I definitely agree with Rowan. I agree with Thomas on that. It is slow, it is a progression, but if we all combine together with our knowledge and our effort, our perseverance, whatever it may be, we can do it.
And I don't want too much tonight, but I even want to jump back on what AJ said, because I think it speaks to why our spheres of influences are so important in the company we keep. I think when we're all trying to figure out what's next and what to do with like a lot of the things that have been happening for years, that racism is just uncovering its nose again. We are trying to figure out how to do everything. But I think it really takes like us everyone specializing in their own field and contributing to fighting and dismantling the system and within what they will like to do or what they're passionate about. And then your friends are doing the same thing. So then you have a friend doing environmental justice. Then you have a friend doing Black women's reproductive justice. Then you have a friend who's an educator, and I think it takes having everyone doing their own little thing. And so that's why, like, at first when like a lot of this stuff was happening, I was super involved in trying to figure out and educating myself on everything. But now as I'm about to go into grad school for higher education, I'm figuring out how do I dismantle higher education and make it more accessible, and let's make sure I read up on that and stuff. So I think AJ brings up a good point of you can't do it all, and everyone has to do their own little thing.
Yeah. And to that point, I think it also takes like us all taking away our ego in a sense, because I think ego will tell us that we can save the world. And not to say that that idea is necessarily bad, but I think ego can be the thing to tell us that we have to be at the forefront of every movement. And I know I talked to Thomas about this a lot, this concept of like this idea of specializing in something to be able to contribute to society and help society move forward. It's like finding, I guess, your area of, or the areas that where we're all have strengths in, and areas where we can be able to contribute based on the gifts and talents that we have, and not necessarily thinking that like we have to be the leader for everything and we have to be at the forefront of every movement. Like, in order for us to move society along, it also takes a certain level of humility for us to all be able to like, just recognize that we're not the it factor in this change. It's like going to take us all collectively together to be able to do it. So I think that's a really great point that everyone's bringing up, of just, finding your part in it. Because also it can get very overwhelming, I'd say, if we don't.
I think it ties in really well with what she said about how even movements that are well-intentioned can become short-sighted when you're not including the right people in those conversations. Like, I look back on a lot of things we did in student government at Clemson, and a lot of times we were just thinking like, we've got to solve this problem as fast as possible. So like, let's keep it to this small group of 4 or 5 people so that we can really get to it. And like, in hindsight, like, you can really like lose sight of what we're all doing. And it's something you have to be like really intentional about, to make sure like you're including enough people in those conversations, because like you said, like, everyone has different strengths and weaknesses. And for one thing, like, you're going to be way more effective if you have more minds in the room. But more importantly, there's way less chance of you leaving people behind in those movements. Like, you got to think about like, are we leaving behind people of color? Are we leaving behind gay people or trans people or disabled people? And so, like Thomas said, like, it's slow, but like, you have to be intentional about it, and that thoroughness matters.
And that definitely takes a level of self-awareness too as well, because I think if I'm not aware of my identity in society and how I identify in society, I probably like am not going to be that useful in those conversations because I'm not self-aware. So it's like, I think also, as much as it like it's us like pitching in with the collective to be able to make change, but then also doing like a lot of self-work to be able to understand like, what are our strengths? Like, what are we not good at? Because I've witnessed a lot of people who, like Jacob said, are well-intended and like just had the right idea, but just didn't necessarily have the self-awareness to recognize that maybe someone else could have done it, or someone else could have been an asset to that project, to that initiative, to that movement. So I think it takes a level of that as well. And also, like, looking at the news, like, you hear people say things and you're just like, bless their heart. Like, they're so well-intended and they like mean well, but they just have it all messed up. Like, this absolutely is not how it is. And it's definitely good to consult other people. So maybe that's a tip to our viewers. For those watching and who feel empowered to go out there and fight against social injustice, consult people who don't look like you so that you don't make the mistake of offending or pressing another group. So maybe that's our book club tip that we can give to everyone.
I think it also like a willingness to accept criticism. And this is something that I've like been learning recently as well. Like, I was recently part of a movement that like admittedly was to help like people of color on our campus, but I think we were definitely lacking in like the types of people of color that we had in our group. And we like had to have a lot of really tough conversations with Clemson alum and faculty and community members about like what our core group of like student leaders look like and how we could be better. And like, in the moment, it definitely doesn't feel good, especially when you feel like you're a well-intentioned person and you're putting in a lot of effort into something and you're like, I promise I'm like doing this like for like quote unquote like the greater good, or like to better our campus or my community or whatever. And sometimes it can be tough, I think, to take criticism in that moment, but it's something that I've been learning is like really crucial and really important. And
you have to like distance your personal self from that. Like the criticism isn't necessarily directed you as a person, but sometimes it also comes from another well-intentioned person who just wants, you know, our community to be better. And so sometimes I think that, you know, and a lot of times you can either be like in an echo chamber where everyone is like agreeing with you and telling you like how great your movement is or whatever, but then a lot of times I think the movements are strengthened when people criticize you and you're willing to accept that criticism and genuinely change because of it.
Rowan, I think something interesting to that point is that we always judge ourselves based off of our intentions and others by their outcomes. And you know, like just thinking about something like, if I make a comment that's insensitive and I don't know it's insensitive, well, I'm going to say, well, I didn't mean it that way. But if I say it to, you know, if someone says it to me, I don't really care how they meant it. And so that's, I think for me, that's one of the difficult things to learn in this kind of environment is, how do you slow down enough to focus on the outcome and not the intent? Because I think most everyone in this moment is acting in good faith, but there's a lot of bad outcome.
Wow. That was good. That's all I have to say. That was a good perspective. Any comments on that? Anyone want to? That was really good. I guess I'll continue because I think I'm included in that. I'm not even speaking about other people. I think if I'm honest with myself, I'm guilty of that as well, where it's easy to kind of judge people based on, you know, the outcome. The outcome. Uh-oh. Like a DJ right there. But, and not necessarily, but, you know, extend ourselves a different kind of grace. That was really good. And that's very important, I'd say, for people to think about. That was really good. Any other thoughts? We're talking about intersectionality, ideas, any quotes, questions, comments? Anything else before we begin to shift? No? Okay. Well, so moving on with this idea of, you know, intersectionality, I think there's this idea that it's so many directions that we could take this. So any ideas of where we want to head next? We want to make this conversational. This isn't scripted. So for those watching, we're just going with the flow right now. Any direction that we want to take this? I don't necessarily want to take it. Someone else take us in a direction.
I guess I'll go for it.
There we go.
I really thought chapter 6 was super, super interesting. And there's just a lot to be said about it. And I took a bunch of different quotes down and just marked down a bunch of different stuff. So I guess I'll start it off with almost like
Start us off. And for those watching, chapter 6 is it starts on page 83 for those who do have the book, and it is the title is police brutality really about race? So take it away, Thomas.
Yeah, I think she paints it really, really beautifully the way she does. And I'll bring up just a couple, like the fact that she says, quote, "The fact that is Black drivers are 23% more likely to be pulled over than white drivers, between 1.5 and 5 times more likely to be searched, while to be shown less likely than whites to turn up contraband in these searches." And she just explains beautifully, I think, the description of when she talks about being pulled over and like DWB and driving while Black, and how I think colloquially a lot of Black people use that interchangeably, and you kind of think about that stuff a lot. I think it goes back to what I said earlier, when I said in the last one, how I'm always thinking about race. So even when I remember I was driving in rural Georgia and I had rented like a zip car my freshman year of college, and it was like late one night, got pulled over by a white policeman, and he asked for my driver's license. He asked for my friend that was in the passenger seat's driver's license. I had to come out the car. I was like searched. The car was searched as well. And it was just like a zip rental car. And like the whole time I was just like sweating bullets. And in my mind, I'm just thinking, I just want to like make it home. I just want to make it out alive in this situation. And it's crazy that we even have to think like that, that's even a part of what our day-to-day struggle is, but it truly is. And I remember my mother sitting down with me when I'm like 12 years old, giving me all the rules. You put your hands on the wheel. You don't like move very quickly. You ask the officer permission if you want to grab something. And all the things that she was spelling out is the lessons that I heard from my mother, from my parents. And so I just thought it brings up a really great conversation of talking about police brutality and the fact of how race plays such a huge role in interactions with the police, and how it's very systemic, and it's things that we're taught at an extremely young age. Like even my mom says, like, don't have your music loud in the car. She doesn't even want me to buy a red car because apparently my cousin was profiled in Columbia, South Carolina because of that. You know, it's these little intricacies that some people don't, think about, that don't have to think about and have the privilege to not. So just wanted to put that out there and I guess see where the conversation goes with that, because I think it's super interesting.
Any thoughts, comments?
I'll just like piggyback off of Thomas and say, I mean, that's the exact same experience I had growing up. I remember, when I was going to get a car, I got my license when I was going to get a car. Literally, that whole conversation, what Thomas just said, was literally the words that were brought to me. They said, because I'm not going to have you be another one that's, that loses their lives from the police, that may be harassed by the police. And you see it so much, not only in like media, but your everyday life. My friend was pulled over and like harassed and got hit on, and everything. He was black as well. And so, it's hard, I guess. I don't know how to explain it. It's kind of hard to, view police brutality, view police as good, trustworthy servants when your experiences don't seem like that. I've been pulled over and I'm shaking, hands on the wheel shaking, because I'm like scared, because I don't want to be that other person. I don't want to be that victim, that has to deal with that. And it could be for maybe going 5 above the speed limit. It can be for, having my phone out, but still, even those simple things, like that can be life or death. And so that's kind of like what I internalize whenever those situations happen. And my little brother just started driving. So literally had to have the conversation with him, me and my dad. And so it's scary. It's scary. I hate that we have to do that, but I know how necessary it is. And so, yeah, I definitely just agree with the same sentiments as Thomas, and just saying that it is a lot.
Yeah. Jacob, you're about to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I can't even imagine like the emotional like toll that would take like day in and day out. Because even when I'm driving, like if I'm going under the speed limit and I see, a highway patrolman or cop on the other side of the road, like my heart jumps out of my chest and I get scared and I watch them in the rearview mirror for, 100 yards to make sure the lights don't come on. And the worst case scenario for me is that I get a ticket or get in trouble or something, not am I going to die or not? Like, and that's tough. I can't imagine.
I'm shaking a little bit. This conversation is always difficult for me because it's difficult to try to describe an experience that is so easy to, I guess, pass off as like individual situations. There's often a concept that when a Black American is negatively impacted by a police officer, there always seems to be a narrative, whether it be in the media or even people who I know, who have this kind of concept that, well, but if this, like, well, if this, maybe if they had done this, then it would have been a different outcome. Or even the concept of like, oh, though that was just one individual. Like there's no way this entire, police force in our country could be corrupt. There's just no way. And there's also arguments, well, it's like, well, what do you say about Black cops? Or what do you say? And it's like, this conversation can be difficult because I think that it's one of those things where it's hard to describe, but I mean, even as a Black woman, and I'll speak for, myself, but as a Black woman, I too have I get nervous when I'm stopped by an officer. I know oftentimes the narrative in the news is of Black men, and that is definitely a real thing. But even as a Black woman, I too am afraid to get pulled over. And for my friends who know me, you may look at me like she literally would not hurt a fly. Like there's just no way. But I guess in certain instances, it's like the person that's pulling me over doesn't know that. And those implicit biases could be, the reason for a different outcome. And it's just one of those things where it's frustrating. It's really frustrating because it's like the people that you want to be able to call are not always the people that you are able to call. And the people that are looked at as the source of protection and security for a community don't always offer that. And I recognize that, I even have law enforcement in my family, and I love them and I want them to be safe, but when they go to work. However, I don't think that should equal, a narrative where, this isn't an issue in this country, or, this system doesn't need fixing. It's just those particular instances. And so, it's so many things I could say. And I think as this conversation goes on, we love to hear other perspectives and ideas and thoughts, even if people disagree. Because this conversation, I think, is important, especially considering what we're dealing with now. And so, yeah, I mean, love to hear other people's thoughts, but this is something that definitely has impacted not just me, but also my family, and stories that I could tell that weren't on the news, but that I know of. So, yeah, we'll love to hear other perspectives and stuff.
So I really like how you brought up the point about implicit biases, because I don't think people really realize how dangerous their biases can be, especially when people of power hold them. And I don't think people really realize how popular culture sort of plays off of people's fears and biases and stereotypes of different minority groups, and how when people, see like a show where like a Black person is being portrayed as like a thug or a gangster, or like somebody who's Hispanic or Latinx is, always selling drugs, or someone who's a person of color who's portraying someone who's Muslim on TV is always a terrorist. I don't think people really recognize how that can form some sort of implicit bias in them. And so when people who have, all this power, especially like the police, they can play off of that implicit bias. And so they can use that. And that's why you get something like police brutality, and how it can happen over and over and over again. Or not just with police brutality, how you can get people having the police called on them because people have these fears, because they're just in our popular culture, they're imbued into our society, into American culture. And I think that's just really dangerous. And I think we have to really work against that and recognize when they're there. And I think that's just a problem that our country has in general.
Yeah, and I think it's just like racism infiltrates so many aspects of our society that I think sometimes we think that it's like the people that are like very obviously racist, like the ones that are like screaming racist slurs, are the ones that are causing a lot of the damage. But I think the everyday average person who has a lot of these implicit biases is causing an equal amount of damage, maybe even more, because they're not pointed out as a racist, or they're not being called out or corrected on their actions. And I know for me, this is a completely different example, not similar to what, I'm not relating this to what you guys were saying about before, but my family's Egyptian, and in Arab culture, and I know this exists in a lot of other cultures too, there's a lot of colorism, having darker skin is viewed as not as beautiful. And that's why there's a lot of celebrities and stuff that will do ads for Fair and Lovely, which is basically a skin whitening cream, and they're skin bleaching creams that are extremely dangerous And ever since like you're like a young kid, like young girls, like I know people would always be like, oh yeah, like you should use a skin whitening cream because like your skin's too dark. Or like when I was younger, I used to play tennis, and like even people in my own family would like make fun of me because I would like get really dark from practice, and because I was out in the sun, and they would like make fun of me for getting darker. And I think that we don't recognize enough that these kinds of things are what cause like this like very like explicit and like dangerous racism that leads to like Black people being killed for like sitting in their houses or like wearing hoodies or like simple things, because we feel like it's not a big deal to say that like darker skin is not as beautiful, or to like push skin whitening creams on girls when they're like 5 and 6 years old. So yeah, I think Robin, you brought up a great point that it's just like so widespread in our entire society and in popular culture.
And before the next comment, definitely like know, like please share your experience. Like it's not just about the Black experience. Like I really want everyone to feel welcome to share their own identity and experience. So if there's anything that seems unrelated, I guarantee you it's related because it's your experience. So please, we welcome that and encourage it. We want to hear more than just the Black experience. So I think these are all good points that are being made, and this conversation is definitely I don't know, it's getting a little difficult, I think, because I think we're touching on we're starting to go a little deeper, and it's starting to get, maybe uncomfortable, maybe that's the word, or maybe it's, just confronting these things that are going on in our society. It kind of back to last week, this idea that sometimes it seems like what we're fighting is beyond the tangible. It's like mental. It's a lot of like things that we can't touch. It's like, how do you deconstruct years and generations of biases? Like, how do we do that? Because I think that's going to be a big part of how we move society forward, is for us to begin to like deconstruct some of these things. And may not happen in our lifetime, but we definitely have to be a part of that change and a part of that push. Any other comments and like topics we can, things that you all want to bring up or mention?
I was going to bring up what a friend, not even a friend, someone I met the other day told me that I thought was very interesting, and I'll bring in another quote. It says, when she said, in this individualist nation, we like to believe that systemic racism doesn't exist. And I think a lot of it plays to our American individualistic culture that we live in. And so someone was telling me about in Europe, so all the time, like you see a stop sign. Let's imagine an American car is just going to roll past a stop sign because their thought process is, oh, it's just me. I'm an individual. If I just roll past it and break the law, no one else is going to do it. But I think on the other hand, I think a lot of other people end up just rolling past the stop sign because everyone ends up doing it because everyone's thinking about themselves. And we have kind of this individualistic culture, just to like, oh, we'll just roll past it. In Europe, but they will stop at the stop sign and actually take that time to like not break the law because they're thinking in more of collectivism and thinking about, hey, like the next person this might help prevent an accident for someone. So let me stop here so it doesn't like continue something bad or something like that. So just that example, I bring it up because I think it's super interesting that it all plays into, like you were saying earlier, of our own egos and how we're so caught up in America's all about ourselves and we just have to think about us. But when you bring these bigger societal problems to these minute things and you confront them and then you notice that they're not just very individual, that they're bigger and that they have a lot more to it, you really are able to break down some things. So when you're calling out like your friend or something like that, or you're telling them, the thing is that's happening on a macro scale all across the nation. Everyone's saying that out-of-pocket thing that they shouldn't say, but when are enough people are going to be like, okay, maybe you shouldn't say this? And so the individual is always much bigger than we think. And I think America has just ingrained in us to be so individualistic. And I personally do not like it at all. I think we should be more of a collectivism and think about other people. And I think that's where empathy comes in. And there's some other things that drive this individualistic capitalism culture just to be at the very top. I think that could be convoluted on a whole entire other argument, but I think it plays into systemic racism that continues to drive it, and that a lot of other things do too. So this individualistic, that is such a hard word to say, thing just really bothers me.
Thomas, I think that's a really good point. I've been kind of hearing this argument, and I feel like we hear it more when we talk about sexual assault, but I think it also applies kind of in this situation and time we're living through now. You'll see things where they'll, say imagine if she was your wife or your sister or your cousin. Imagine if it were someone that you loved being assaulted or being harassed. And that's a great argument. And I wouldn't want anyone that I love being assaulted or hurt in any way, but I don't want anyone, regardless of their relationship to me, being hurt in any way. And I bring up the sexual assault argument because I'm most familiar with it, but the kind of same thing goes when you're talking about this individualistic society. If it doesn't affect me or the people I love, I tend to kind of out of sight, out of mind. And we need to kind of steer away from this thought process and kind of think of ourselves as a collective society, as we all are responsible for each other's well-being, especially if you have the power to change it, rather than it doesn't really bother me, I'm not really into politics. That frustrates me so much.
And it's the reason, even on a bigger, it's the reason why COVID is outbreaking so badly. We're all just thinking about ourselves, and we're like, no one's gonna care until it actually affects their best friend or their family member, and it sucks. Right. But yeah,
I think even tying back into police brutality, I think the author mentioned this at the end of chapter 6, where she talked about when people of color come to you, come to white people, other people, and tell about their experiences. Hey, we don't want you to fear. We just want you to come together as one and demand the rights that you get and that deserves to be granted towards everyone else. It's a unity thing. This is I think Ariana said it best. You wouldn't want anyone to go through that. You wouldn't want anyone to go through that fear. Because that's something that I wouldn't wish upon my brother. That's something I wouldn't wish upon my sister. That's something I wouldn't wish upon Jacob, Ariana, Will, Thomas, Robin, everybody on this chat, anybody. I wouldn't want to wish that on no one. I think Thomas and Ariana said it best. We have to start focusing on everyone as a collective. We have to take ourselves out of the equation and focus on everybody. I mean, even with police, even with, ourselves and how we think about things, nothing is going to get better. Nothing is going to get better unless we really, think about others in a sense. I know with police brutality, the same way that you serve and protect white communities or whatever type of community is the same that we want in diverse communities and Black communities. That's all we're asking. All we're asking is for that equal, fair chance that everybody else is getting. I mean, even in our Pledge of Allegiance and liberty and justice for all. That's what we want. Liberty and justice for all. And it's nothing hard to ask. You take out your bias, you take out everything. That's what you truly focus on. Focus on those fundamental and foundational words, and liberty and justice for all, equality for all, fair treatment for all. You have to stop being, fair treatment for me because of this privilege or because of that privilege. No, if you're going to do it for me, do it for somebody else as well. And do it for another person.
That's really good. And I think even to that point, AJ, that frustration is we're not asking for anything grand, and sometimes when we talk about it, we're either met with gaslighting and kind of just making it seem like that experience just doesn't exist, or there's this, we're going to bring it up, this age-old statistic that's brought up of Black on Black crime. Yeah. And this idea that before you worry about officers' shootings, worry about your own communities and worry about Black on Black crime. Black on Black crime. And that idea, quote, in her book, she says, is racist. That entire term is racist. It's as if someone is trying to justify police, a system, police brutality by saying, well, you all kill each other, so why can't we kill you too? Like, or you all kill each other, so like focus on that before you ask us to stop whatever issue we have over here of us killing you and your community. And that idea, more importantly, is like, I know Robin and I, we were speaking, there's no, like, no one says like white on white crime, and to defend any type of movement that's geared towards providing that community with the resources that they need to be healthy, safe, and happy, whatever that is. But for whatever reason, when Black Americans are asking for a very simple request to just be treated, it's with fairness and justice, it's like, well, look at you, and I'm going to be blunt. I've heard people say, well, they're just thugs out there. And it's like, where is the sense and level of humanity? Like, I know of white crime, but I don't use that to justify why I won't help secure safety for other people in a certain community. And it's getting to a point where I think people are just getting fed up, and people are like, look, like, if this is not going to change, we're going to do something about it. And for some people that may look radical, but at this point, I think Black Americans, we are sick and tired of looking on our phones and seeing another innocent Black man or woman, child, a 12-year-old was shot because he was seen as a threat, being killed, and people telling us, well, it's just one bad apple. Being killed and people telling us, well, you all kill each other in your own communities. Being killed over and over again for things that my white friends, not white enemies, people I love, my white friends would just get a slap on the wrist for. And it's like, I sit at home and it's like, I have moments where I am literally just furious. I'm shaking because at some point you feel helpless. You're like, how in the world do we dismantle this system? How in the world do we get people to recognize that my Blackness is not a threat? And there are bad people out there. There's of all colors and races, but that's no way to justify what we're continuously seeing over and over and over and over again. And it's to a point where it's just frustrating, and we literally, like, this country, it has to come to reality and stop pretending that this is not an issue. And like you said, AJ, I wouldn't wish that on anyone else either. Like, if people, and I can do a better job of, if there's an issue with another community of people as it relates to anything in this country, I want to be there to support and help in any way that I can. It's not just, and I guess I'm speaking about police brutality from a Black perspective because that's where the conversation is, but by no means am I saying that this is just, a Black problem we have to address. Like, this literally is, a society problem, and I wouldn't want to wish this on anyone else either. Like, it's not just because it's me, it's because no one should have to go through that. Sorry for my rant. That's just, it's a lot.
Not a rant at all. A very well thought out statement, I think. And I'm losing my train of thought here, but we were kind of talking about how you feel like you're being told, like, you're speaking about this because it directly affects you. But not only does it directly affect you, it affects like your family. And regardless if it directly affected you or not, you would speak out against it. And I think that's what people are kind of like having this block against. Right now, like, people want to stay out of the drama. People want to stay out of the politics. People don't want to get involved because I don't know much and I'm not educated. And they think that that's a valid excuse, and that it's not simple to go get educated, which it is. That you don't need, half an hour, pick an issue and educate yourself. And that is something that I've been trying to, like, very directly combat just in the conversations that I have with people, where they say, like, well, it doesn't really affect me, like, I don't really know much about it, and try to, like, encourage gaining that knowledge. And it might not affect you directly, but people are hurting. And I know you're a good person. I know you care about other people. And this is a really important thing that needs as many voices as it can get. And there still seems to be this, like, block where people feel like they're not Black, they don't have a Black voice, and they're not really needed in the conversation.
Yeah. And we need everyone. We need everyone.
There's a thought I had that kind of ties into what you were just saying there, and then also to the conversation earlier about individualism versus focus on the community. And I think individualism is a good thing, but you can't have individualism if there's things that are affecting entire segments of all, like police brutality would be a bad thing if it just happened to Jim. It's a evil thing if it happens to everyone like Jim. And when a person is not being is denied the opportunity to be understood as an individual and is understood by their community, when that is something that's happening regularly, we have to be able to put aside our own egos and our own self and work for the improvement of the community so that we can be understood as individuals. Like Jacob, when you were saying, like, when I got pulled over, my worry was, how do I explain this to my dad? Not, am I going to get home tonight? And the reason that that was my worry is because I got to be understood as Will Galloway, not as white male ages 18 to 40. And I think that to me, I don't know if that stream of consciousness made any sense, but we have to focus on the community so that people can be understood as individuals.
I definitely see that point. And I think that's interesting because I think, I see the idea that, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's this idea that for us to be able to, we can't judge people based off of their community. We have to be able to see them as individuals. So saying that, like, yes, community is definitely important, and we are able to fix these societal problems together by putting our egos aside, but at the same time there is an area where being seen as an individual is important. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a big part of it. And I also think that a big part of the problem is that when it comes to systems of power and implicit biases and all these other things, for people who aren't in the dominant group, whatever that is, in a certain identity, they're denied the opportunity to be understood as an individual. And so individualism fails a person when they're not given the opportunity to be understood as an individual.
Okay, yeah. No, I see that. And that is, I think, I in that sense, I agree in that society often judges us off of just their, I guess, preconceptions of skin color or what they think of an entire group of people, instead of looking at people individually as, this is a human being, whole different person outside of maybe their, I guess, collective or community. I will say also to that point that I think that how we fix that, I'm not sure, because I think that to a certain extent, there's this, as humans, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this, as humans, I feel like we're trying to in a way fix implicit biases. And then also at the same time, I think it's partially instinctual for us to try to group people together for our ability to, and this could be getting way deep into like the whole concept, the philosophical concept people have about human nature, but there's this also like maybe idea that we use those biases as a way for survival. Like we like to group people, which isn't right by any means, but I think that you're bringing up a good point that we often group people based on these biases or based on these, preconceived notions that we have, which inhibit us from seeing people by person to person. Whether or not it's possible for us to completely get away from that, I'm not sure, but I definitely think I definitely hear and see your point for sure.
Will, I really liked when you were talking about like when you were pulled over, you had kind of the opportunity to be understood as an individual, and I might have misunderstood, but I feel like that's what I heard you say. So like where this took me was I've been pulled over before, and the police officer has seen a Clemson sticker or my Clemson shirt, and he comes over to me and he's like, oh, you're at Clemson? Like, what year are you? My daughter goes there. Where are you headed? Oh, you're headed home for spring break, or you're headed where and where and where. I kind of understand you. I understand the group that you fall into. And I never even got a ticket for going over the speed limit. Whereas if he had seen someone completely different skin color sitting in my driver's seat, he might not have even bothered to pay attention at Clemson shirt or ask me where I was going, and may have just wanted, I've never been asked if I had drugs in my car in my life by anyone. And reading in the book when she's talking about how that's the officer's first question, just completely, like, I knew these things, but seeing it like in that perspective of a 16-year-old girl getting pulled over just like brought it to a whole new place for me. And I think that point you made is like, that's a clear example of it. I was able to be understood for who I am, whereas someone who looked different than me may not have even been given the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I deserved the ticket I got, and there's no going around that. But Old Stone Church Road will get you every time. But yeah, I mean, like, one of the things that hit me one time, I can't remember when this hit. It was before all the George Floyds. It was maybe a year ago. Thinking about how, like, so it was night, right? And I, like, while the cop was walking over, I reached into my glove box and grabbed my license and registration. Well, there've been people who've been shot for doing that. Like, that's just wild to me that, like, that never even entered my mind. And I don't know, that's something that's just hard to wrap my mind around.
One thing that's interesting to me, like, as we talk about empathy and police brutality and like not wishing it upon people, is like, I think it's really interesting, like what she talks about in the book, but like what the idea of police means to different people. You know, white people see police as a tool to be used at their disposal because, like, and not as a threat because they've never had a reason not to think that. But I think a lot of white people do secretly recognize the way like police treat black people. And I think the proof of that is like the way that some white people weaponize the police against black people. Like, we joke about Karens a lot, but like all the videos you see like on Twitter now or Facebook of like white people, and particularly like white women, calling the police against black people who are just minding their business and like for no reason, and like they understand like what they're doing in the context of what they're doing and like the danger they're putting that other person in. And I think that's like really dangerous, and a thing like that should be talked about more too, because like that's how you end up with a Tamir Rice situation or a Breonna Taylor situation. And so like I think like what we like see the police like as, you know, like, and how that fits into everything. That's probably a lot, but
Yeah, no, that was good.
A quote that, you know, kind of correlates with what Jacob just said was from the book, page 91. Said our police force was not created to serve Black Americans. It was created to police Black Americans and serve white Americans. And so, like, the way that, you know, we talked about the Karens calling, you know, they know what they're doing. and that's what you don't want to see. That's what you don't want to see. You want to see people fight for their counterparts, whether that be African American, whether that be, you know, Indian, whether that be another, you know, race or ethnicity. Instead of using that tool, using what they know to go against somebody else. And so I just wanted to bring that quote in.
Yeah.
That's not the way to do it.
And it's interesting, I think, also to think about the way in which police are or portray themselves to different communities. Because I know in the Muslim community, a lot of times the police are often a very welcomed force, and they're kind of like a sense of security for the Muslim community, because a lot of times like mosques and stuff like that will be worried that like someone will come in and like vandalize the mosque or like shoot up the mosque or something like that. It's like a very like valid concern that a lot of Muslim Americans have. So I know a lot of times in my own community I've seen like the mosque or like whatever like bring in the police as like a sense of security. And it always just like intrigues me to think about like the privilege that we have, that we can call in the police and they'll like protect us, or at least that's what we think they're going to do, and we can kind of rely on them, and we kind of feel more secure in our place of worship having the police there. Whereas for other communities, it's not the same. So even within different minority groups, like other minorities that are not Black, like have the privilege of having completely different interactions with the police, at least for Muslims that are not Black, like in my personal experience, like as a non-Black Muslim. And something else I think that frustrates me is that, back to kind of the idea of talking about like empathy and like, you know, understanding that, like Ariana was mentioning before, like we don't want anything bad to happen to anyone, not just to people that we love. I think like the moral argument in our society has lost so much weight. And I really think that our generation needs to go back and like reassess and figure out like where that argument lost its weight and bring it back. Because a lot of times, and this idea is perpetuated in higher education a lot, this idea of kind of like having your narrative and a thing that you care about, and you care about it because it has affected you. And a lot of times like administrators will tell you, or someone who's like helping you like write an essay or something for graduate school will be like, why do you care about this? Like it doesn't affect you, it doesn't make sense in your life story. And I think that just kind of goes back to show that, like Thomas was mentioning earlier, higher education can perpetuate these ideas. And in this scenario, I think it's the idea that the moral argument of I don't want anything bad to happen to anyone of any background has lost so much weight in our society. And I think we really need to bring that back as a generation.
That's good.
I would definitely this is everything that's been said has been incredible. I want to make 2 recommendations. I want to read off a quote that I wrote down, and it's a part of a recommendation. First off, if anyone wants to see more stuff, I watched a Netflix show called 100 Humans. It's kind of new. And it had an episode just on implicit bias, and it was really good because it's crazy. It talks about just what we were talking about. They did an exercise where they had people basically have to like shoot someone, or like shoot like the armed robber, the person that was stealing or something. And they did it where like it was a white person, and they did it when there was a black person who was a production assistant who they interacted with. They shot the black person like 7 more times out of the 10, and it was crazy to really see, and to be able to see that, and like people like started crying afterward because I don't think they start to really understand what their biases really did to them. And it's a really good episode. So 100 Humans, Implicit Bias, definitely look that up. And then I want to read off a quote of, we're talking about our communities, and I think this really puts into perspective like the community I identify with as being a Black person living in the American South. There's a website called American Communities Project that's been talking about some like COVID-19 stuff and disparities and different things like that. It has some good articles. But this is about African American people in the Southeast. So from North Carolina to Texas, the percentage of people with a college degree, just a college degree, is 20.5%. That's 10% lower than the national average. The unemployment is 7%, which is roughly 2% higher than other communities around the nation. And African American South also experiences elevated rates of poverty in children at 34% compared to the national 20%. So when I think I bring up these statistics to really hone in on our communities, and I think why we get super emotional, why we're so charged to do the work that we do, is because it affects the people, like it affects our families, and it affects everyone that actually are in our live spaces that we're with. And the fact that I think about this all the time, that I even have a college degree and I'm even going to get a master's, is like unheard of. You know, it's crazy. That's the exception. And the fact that Black people in this country have to be exceptional to get a piece. You have to be exceptional. And that is crazy. And it's crazy that I have friends that are income law students, grad students, and stuff like that. And that is the rarity. And I just can't wrap my mind around that.
Let's maybe even, and so, you know, we're moving on this idea of implicit bias, and we have some other chapters where I think it kind of goes, and I guess transitioning to those, and, you know, making sure that not making sure, but, you know, seeing how that impacts not just police brutality, but then also other areas of our system, and not just from the Black perspective, but also from any perspective. So as we shift to these next, you know, few topics in the book, definitely bring any perspective from a woman, male, whatever perspective and identity we have, because higher education, it definitely is an experience, and it is an experience where I think we all can, you know, we can all talk about. So the next chapter is affirmative action. How specifically, how can I talk about affirmative action? And it kind of ties in for those watching with the 8th chapter, which is what is the school to prison pipeline? And so for the sake of not controlling the conversation and just continuing to let it flow, we can transition into those chapters or bring in other topics, even bring some things that are happening in the news, whatever. But I think the core theme that we're working with right now is implicit bias. So maybe let's talk about a little bit about affirmative action if individuals don't have anything else to say about the police brutality chapter, or if you do, feel free to talk about it. But affirmative action, and maybe even just the perspective in higher education or in professional settings. Let's go for it. So anyone want to start us off?
I can go. So before even reading this book and hearing about affirmative action and like kind of reading the history of when it started, I would hear it a couple of times in high school when we were applying to college. And I remember vividly this interaction with one of my classmates who was older than me at the time. So I was a junior and he was a senior, and he was going to go to college. And I told him I was going to apply to a certain school, and he goes, "You're going to get in, you're brown." And I was like, what? And I had never heard that statement out of anyone's mouth. Well, I'd heard other like racial slurs being thrown at me growing up, but I'd never heard you're going to get into college because you're brown. I thought it was because you're smart, you score high on the SAT, you have a certain GPA, but I was really thrown back, and that statement has stuck with me, and I'm friends with this person, and it is like hard to change opinions when that's what they've always heard. There's something in this chapter that says that talks about affirmative action and how some white males feel like their opportunities are being taken away because people of color, specifically Black people, are given more opportunities just to level out the playing field. And I thought this chapter really spoke to my experience with that person, because I didn't really know what affirmative action was in high school, and I thought that was crazy.
Yeah, that definitely is something. Like I don't identify as brown, but I've heard people say that, where they just automatically assume that like you're have this particular identity, and this is the outcome because of it. So that definitely can be something tough to deal with. Any comments or thoughts, ideas that anyone wants to add to that?
It kind of reminds me of that quote of like, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality can feel like oppression. And I think like I've had moments like where, you know, in college where, you know, I didn't get a certain position or a certain award, and my white friends would say to me in private, like, "Oh, like, don't sweat it. Like, the only reason you didn't get it was because you're white." And like, that just feels like so wrong to me. And that logic just feels so like flawed, because I think it's easy for white people who don't have a full like understanding of like what they think affirmative action is to suddenly like turn it into a victimhood thing. And I think like as a white person, like in those conversations, especially those private conversations, like it's important to like, you know, think about, okay, like one, like it's highly unlikely that the reason you didn't get this because you were white, but like two, you've gone your whole life getting a lot of things because you were white. And three, like take that hurt or frustration that you like think you're feeling now and imagine like what your Black friends must feel like after like continually experiencing like real actual mistreatment because of the color of their skin all the time. um but yeah, it's a tough thing because like a lot of people like do have strong opinions on it, and it can be a touchy thing, and it's often like a very personal thing, so it's hard to like remove yourself and not get the ego or not get too personal about it. But it's certainly tough.
I feel like it's always been hard for me to discuss affirmative action with people because I mean, I don't know if it's a sound thought or what, but I just think the sole reason that we don't have an equal number of people in the society, in our community, in whatever position, there should be, just equal representation, is just enough of an argument to make the case for why we need affirmative action. I mean, clearly, if our fake made believe community is 50% Hispanics and then 50% white people, that should be reflective in government, in jobs, in schools. And if it's not, then there's your answer. There's clearly some systematic reason, some systemic reason that's stopping just the flow of nature and how it should just be. And it's so hard for me to have this conversation with people because I don't understand how people don't see that point.
Yeah, so I really like what you just said, Ariana, and then the examples that Jacob and Bali brought up that made me think of what she talked about in the book when she was given the promotion and then the promotion was rescinded. And she said that there were rumors and grumblings that she didn't deserve any of her accolades or promotions because, basically because of her race. And I feel like, well, for me personally, I think I've had a couple of experiences where, I'll get into school or like something like that, or I'll get a position, and there will be comments thrown, well, it's only because you're Black or something like that. And so I think that not just the Black community, but I think a lot of minorities have heard comments like that or have that type of feeling where people try to undermine their achievements and say that it wasn't deserved. And I think that's definitely an issue because for me personally, I want to be recognized for what I do. And so like when you don't recognize like the work that I put into doing something and you just assume that I get it because, I haven't worked as hard as the next person, that's really frustrating and irritating, to say the least.
Yeah, and it's especially frustrating when people attribute their own successes to their hard work, but when a non-white person is successful, it's not because they worked hard, it's because of some like hidden advantage like given to them by affirmative action or whatever else. And it's just like really interesting to see how like even the concept of hard work isn't something that society views as like, possible for people of color. And that's really frustrating for me to just like hear what people have to say about that. And also I think it, just like the toll that it takes on people of color and minorities is really important too. Like just hearing things like that can make people feel a sense of imposter syndrome, which is already so common in our society today. So if you're like constantly hearing from people around you that the only reason you're successful is because of affirmative action or because like they needed to meet their diversity quota, so they like pulled you onto this like committee or they gave you this position, then I think that that's just like really also damaging to minorities. And like we need to be providing like resources for minorities specifically to take care of their mental health, because these kinds of things really can take a toll on how people feel and how and on their levels of like self-esteem and self-confidence.
And I think you all have brought up like really good points concerning that and have like brought in very good perspectives concerning it and how it impacts many different people, people of color, and African Americans. And so I think too with affirmative action, The argument that you hear a lot where it's like you have to, or it's kind of like, well, someone has gotten this award or accolade or scholarship, whatever it may be, because of their race or identity or skin tone. It's interesting because that's very opposite of like how I feel as I'm working towards whatever accolade, scholarship thing that I, I'm seeking to accomplish. And I'm not saying that other people don't work hard when I say what I'm about to say. I'm just speaking from my experience in that being an African American woman in places and spaces of higher education, um, it's not easy. It's one of those things where it's like I have to balance, truly being authentic to who I am, but then also like tiptoeing around this fine line of how to interact in those spaces, when to speak up about certain things, when to kind of like it's so many things that go on in my head in those spaces that I don't think people necessarily understand. And then like I don't think it's funny because I don't think people necessarily understand what it's like to be the minority in those spaces, whatever kind of minority you are. So I'll speak from my perspective as a Black woman. Going to Clemson University, there were ample times where even in biology classes of like 100 plus students, like I'd look around and it'd be like 8 of us in class. And then in my political science courses, there'd be like out of maybe 25 to 30 students, like there have been classes where I have literally been the only Black person there. And it's like instances where, navigating those spaces aren't easy. And you do, in a sense, I know someone mentioned feeling like you have to be exceptional all the time. Like if I make a mistake in class or if I say something that, wasn't, I guess, the smartest or brightest, whether people are judging me for my race or not, I always have that in the forefront of my mind of like, what are they going to think this Black girl just said, or I messed up, or, so it's difficult. And even I think the whole purpose of affirmative action was to try to bridge the gaps within society. And the funny thing is we still have those gaps. Those gaps are exponential. I don't know if I'm using the right word, but they're large and they're still present. And think about going 400 years, you can't get an education, Jim Crow, you're getting subpar education, if any at all, then you are fighting to be able to sit in a classroom, and all of these things over time. You think about generations of people. Like I have friends who are able to say like, oh, my great grandfather attended this university. Like for me with education, I can maybe go back to a great, maybe no, not even really a great. I can go back to like my grandparents. And even then, there's many people who don't get that. There are many African American people who are literally first generation college students. Like their entire family, they're the first in their college to get an education. So it's like these disparities are still here, and I recognize this idea that like you definitely don't want someone to get something over you because of their race, but I think it takes away from like what's the purpose of it and what's really being done by it. And also it takes away from the amount of work that people of color and Blacks do to be able to be where they're at, on top of all of the disparities that we already face and have to overcome. So that's kind of just, I think, also another perspective to consider, that it's not just filling in these positions. It's like we actually have to operate in those spaces when we're there, and that's not easy. It's a lot of pressure.
I love what you, I think, so eloquently displayed of what it is, like I don't know if I'll say plight, because plight's always like, I guess, a negative term, but I guess I can use like the plight of like an African American student on a predominantly white campus. Is you're constantly thinking of, is me being late to this meeting going to now stereotype the rest of the race of Black people? Is this going to make this white person's mind, or this non white person's mind, oh, I'm now the late Black kid? And that is always extremely, extremely tough thing. And it's very hard. It's because I will bring up a quote from what she said about when she's talking about how she got to get pulled away from her classes and stuff. And she says, how many were left behind? I think about my first grade class and wonder how many Black and brown kids weren't identified as talented. And I went to very much one of these schools that she kind of displays and talks about, and how like my schools would get like an F on its report card every year. And only 10% or maybe 15% of my class ended up even going to college. Just a lot of the kids that were in honors that I was surrounded by. And every day I'm constantly thinking about, I'm not only going to my master's, I'm not going to the University of Houston for my master's of education for me. I'm going for the kids that didn't get a chance to do it. I'm going for a community full of Black people that did not have the same opportunities as me. So how do I collectively think to now, once I get this education, I not just go and make my money, I now have to make sure I pull other people with me and make sure I go back to my own community and I'm teaching something for working class people who will never get a chance to get an education. And so I think that whole entire plight is what I deal with when going through college. I'm not just going to go home on spring break and like have a good time. I'm constantly thinking about, maybe I need to work to get some extra money. Maybe I need to do this certain thing. And I think that's what a lot of people, and not just Black people, a lot of minorities face, is it's not just going to university, having a good time and enjoying that time. It's now a mental and emotional gridlock that you have every time you step into the classroom. And it's what I experienced when my first day of college, going into my philosophy class, and I was the only Black student, and I'm terrified because I went to all Black high school, and I don't know how I'm gonna talk to all these white people. Crazy how I ended up having like a diverse friend group. But like you think at the beginning, like, how can I do this? So it's emotional and mental battle.
Yeah.
Man, I have to go back to Thomas, man. It's in the same sentiments. I think like going to a university, predominantly white institution, as an African American male, like I was in the College of Education. I'm the only Black person in the class. First of all, male, female. Now I'm the only Black male with like my white female counterparts, and so it was tough. So being late to class, I never want to be late. Be like maybe 5 minutes early, because I didn't want to follow that stereotype. Whenever there was a race discussion, who were they gonna look at? Me, to have that conversation. And then I think to go back off of what Thomas was saying, I think as like African American male, when you enter college and you're around so many people, you understand that it's not about your, going back to the individualistic conversation that we have, it's not about yourself as the individual. You know, you're on this journey for so many other people. So not only are you, you know, trying to figure out, or how I'm gonna get through this class, or, you know, am I gonna pass this test? But it's like, I gotta pass this test because I gotta be an example towards this person, towards that, because people are looking up to you, because it is rare. It's an exceptionality that's like far beyond measures, where you are African American male, you are in this position, or you are doing this thing, or you could be any minority doing this thing, or, you know, excelling in this way. But it's not about your individual self. It's about, you know, so much. Your family is depending on you. They're believing in you. You have friends back home that are believing in you. You have kids that were under you that are believing in you, and you don't want to prove them wrong. I mean, you don't want to disappoint them. And so that has been like my biggest pressure, my biggest fear was basically failure, in a sense. That I could fail for myself, but I didn't want to fail for others. With the position that I'm in, with me being an African American male in this vicinity and space, and I wanted to push as hard as I can. I want to do as much as I can to let any and everybody know that you can do it too. That you can do it too. And so
And
yeah. Go ahead,
no,
Tom.
I was gonna say, and that feel for others is almost more of a weight than and that's the interesting part about it.
Yeah, that's it. That is it.
Yeah, and hearing Thomas talk about like his aspirations and AJ echoing them, like I was thinking, I was like, that's exactly the point, is kind of like this idea of like the minority tax, you know, like someone who's from the majority like is going to grad school and they're like, I'm going because I want to be successful and I want to, you know, make money, or I want to like have this title or get into this like prestigious job later on. Whereas like, you know, as like Thomas was like very clearly stating, like when he was talking about like what he wanted to do with his degree, and AJ is like being a minority, like you kind of carry this weight that like you have to be perfect and you have to not only succeed in life, but you kind of feel like you have to use your successes. And sorry, Thomas, I'm not speaking for you. I'm just kind of like, you know, extending it from like my
You are perfect.
perspective.
Yeah, you're good. You are perfect.
But that you have to like kind of succeed for your people and your community. And I think that just kind of like shows the weight that minorities carry. And like even like going to like a predominantly white institution as a person of color, like a minority, like every day you're like going to class and you're like worrying, like everyone had mentioned before, like I don't want to answer something wrong or be late because I don't want to make people think poorly of like my community or my people. Like that's the additional weight that we carry when we walk into these spaces and when we walk through like life in general. And that in and of itself is a disadvantage, you know, because you have to spend that time and that emotional and mental labor thinking about all of these things that your white classmates aren't thinking about, and they're using that time to like focus on themselves and like their hobbies and taking care of themselves and studying for their classes. Or even like, you know, when you're a minority, like in a predominantly white space, like a lot of times you're pulled into like meetings about like social justice and multicultural student organizations and supporting students of color. And a lot of times I think minority students are so kind and they like really love to be in those spaces, but also like a lot of times that's your time. And you know, you're not just at that point, you're not in school to get a degree, you're in school to get a degree and to also be like the token spokesperson for your people and to be that example and to, you know, be that perfect role model, I guess. And it's like a lot of emotional and mental weight. And I think when you add up all that time and that mental labor, like it really takes a toll on people over time.
And even I'm sorry, you can go ahead.
Sorry, Thomas, you go ahead.
No, I bet. No, my bad. But I just was gonna say like, and I 100%. It's almost like, and I think about a lot of times like how like I've been in a bunch of like Clemson University videos and stuff, and like done a lot for the university on a wider scale and different things like that. Like in hindsight, that shouldn't have to be what I do on a daily. Yes, I love being able to someone open an admissions pack and say, oh, like a Black person goes to Clemson, maybe I can be successful and thrive there. Maybe that can be it. But that shouldn't have to be a part of like my grander scale of me just getting a higher ed degree. So I think you put that beautifully, Ryan. So thank you.
I was just going to add that I was recently having a conversation with one of my friends who he's an African-American male. He comes from a lower socioeconomic community. And he pretty much explained to me everything that you guys just said. He kind of like echoed those sentiments, but he also expressed that he felt a guilt that it was him that was becoming successful and it wasn't the kid who sat next to him in English class. And he had this kind of like imposter syndrome that he was the one who was able to kind of like break the stereotype and like become successful, which just kind of like, as Roanne was saying, adds to that like weight that you have to carry. I have never been made to feel guilty for my success. And I can't imagine like the mental like struggles and like the interpersonal like arguments that you have with yourself for just succeeding and doing well. So yeah, thank you guys for sharing that.
So the conversation, I think we are heading towards 2 hours, so we don't want to like continue to like hold everyone, but you know, I think, and stop me because we remember what happened last time if I'm wrong, but you know, the conversation, it definitely, we touched on some difficult stuff, like some police brutality. That is not an easy conversation. Affirmative action, that is not an easy conversation. Just implicit bias, something that you can't necessarily put your hands on, but you have to kind of describe through storytelling, is not easy to talk about. And so I think it's awesome hearing everyone give their different perspectives and give, you know, just their ideas about, you know, maybe friends who've been impacted themselves, how they're impacted. And one thing that someone mentioned before we come to a complete close, I cannot remember who, I think it was Ariana, but this idea that racial injustice, no matter who it's against, Black Americans, whomever it's against, it doesn't just impact that particular group, which it absolutely does impact that group, and we can't negate that it impacts whichever group that the oppression is happening to the most. But at large, it impacts society, even people who don't identify a part of those groups. Our society cannot be our best selves when our brothers and sisters are suffering, and when our neighbor is at their best selves that they can be. And I'm appreciative of this conversation because I feel like, and I think we can all agree that in hearing these stories, it's not that we're like going to completely understand or be able to, really live that experience, by no means. But at the very least, we can say, okay, like, what can I do to better change this narrative that continues to permeate in society and cause so many issues for people, my community, whomever. And even what Bali mentioned, something that I wouldn't have been able to, understand or identify with, this idea that someone just automatically assumes that because you're brown, you just get in and you're smart and whoop-de-doo, like taking away from your success. Or with Roanne, with her identity as a Muslim, just thinking about how that impacts her identity as a person of color on campus. And even to my white friends on this chat, the experiences that you have with your friends, and sometimes in family, and having to relay this information to maybe people who don't understand, and even your own plight. All of us, like Latina, whomever, I think we all have a part in this society, and we all are human beings, and we all need each other. And that's what I keep, at the end of the day, I think that's the message that we keep getting, is that, like, no matter who we are, we need each other, and we can't do this by ourselves. So that we don't keep you here for forever and ever and ever and ever, stay on. I'm going to end recording so that we can officially say goodbye. Any lasting thoughts before we close? No? Well, you all are amazing, and very appreciative of you. Robin, any last words? You're on mute.
Yeah, just thank you guys for, sharing your experiences. I know that this conversation in particular, this discussion in particular, was kind of, at least for me, it was a little bit difficult. Like, I was getting a little like nervous and emotional because it's kind of hard for me to talk about this stuff in settings where, I don't know everybody intimately. So I just want to really like applaud you guys and thank you guys for, doing that and participating in this discussion and sharing those thoughts and experiences.
Yes. So we have 2 more, and again, you all are amazing. And for those who are tuning in with us, like, stay tuned for the next ones that we post. We might separate this into 2. But yeah, so you all stay on, and we'll end recording right now.